before then we go into that definition of what invasive species are, let's talk about what native species are, okay? How we define those. So native species are basically the species that are in a specific habitat, they thrive in that habitat, and they live there under certain conditions, and they also have natural enemies, and predators, pathogens, and so forth, to keep those populations in check, okay? And they have sort of evolved in that ecosystem, in that habitat, within a specific niche. Now, going into kind of the definition of the invasive species, not all, of course, species become invasive when they enter a new habitat. So, going into the next definition, we're talking about non-native species, because those species are the ones that are entering a new habitat. They live somewhere outside the distributional range, what we call our native distributional range, and they come in either accidentally or deliberately, mostly by humans as carrions. And again, I want to emphasize that that non-native species are not necessarily invasive, okay? Now, what happens, what do we define as a species that is invasive or becomes invasive is the non-native species that enters a new habitat that has adverse effects, negative effects on the ecosystem, affects habitats and biodiversity, and can have economic impacts, okay? Now, invasive species, we're talking about plants, vertebrates, other organisms, marine or freshwater organisms, but they have some common characteristics. They have few natural predators in that introduced range, and few natural competitors or diseases or pathogens to keep them in control. Okay, they're usually reproducing a lot. Are generalist species that we're talking about dietary generalist species, meaning they can feed on a broad kind of depth of prey, okay, a lot of different things that they can prey on, and are usually very aggressive. So once they enter that introduced habitat, they can actually prey or outcompete those native species. Now, going into the impact, and this is kind of like important here, we have different types of impacts of the invasive species. The most direct that we can think of is predation. Okay? So it's when one species directly preys upon another in that introduced habitat. Okay? Just like these rodents, in this case here, they prey upon the nestlings or the bird populations in those closed habitats. Another example, who has heard of guam? Yes, the brown tree snake, right here. A big problem in Guam, okay? Like preying upon all these like bird populations, rodents, native species in that island, on that island. And really like declined those populations of those native species up to a point where we needed to take action, okay? Does anybody remember or know what kind of action that even was? What worked? They actually threw live bait, poisonous bait from helicopters. Okay, it was that bad.
Are there recovering populations at all, or all the birds just?
Of course, you know, the recovery is being slow, but that was one way of trying to control the species before you have total displacement and extinction of the native species. Okay, so now moving on from like direct predation, we're talking about different types of impacts, different effects. Talking about herbivory, so organisms that affect plants. Here we have the hemlock woolly adelgid. That's been a very, it's been affecting negatively hemlocks, especially in the eastern US. And why is this an indirect impact? So hemlocks actually regulate air and water temperature when they're by the big streams. Okay, and hemlocks are a harbor of like a lot of organisms. So they're kind of like forming their own kind of habitat, an ecosystem with birds, insects, and so forth, with some invertebrates even being important to aquatic organisms once they fall in the streams. Okay, so and that shadow that the hemlocks create over the rivers, that's actually regulating the air and water temperature. But now with the invasion of the woolly tailgate, those hemlocks start dying. Okay, and subsequently, all those organisms that are associated with the hemlock, those are being displaced. Another effect is they can alter whole ecosystems, just like this alga, the Caulerpa taxifolia in the Mediterranean. It's a seagrass, and that kind of formed seagrass meadows on the floor of the Mediterranean, changing kind of like the native animal community in that area. Okay, and that's kind of like a tropical species that was accidentally introduced from a sea tank. Okay,
From what?
from an aquarium. Yeah. Another good example is the Asian chestnut blight that kind of eliminated the American chestnut, which was a dominant species for the canopy species throughout the US, about 30% of that, and that led to total structural changes in those forests. Okay, so some specialists.
Could we still look at models of impact from invasive species and assume that they might be similar in a situation where there's a native plant having the same effect on an ecosystem, if it's non-native to that ecosystem, essentially? Okay, so it's like invasive in that ecosystem.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and so there's a lot of like modeling software, like risk assessments that are being done in a more applied approach. So you can see kind of like what will the impact be in the future or in this kind of type of ecosystem before it happens. Okay. Another big one is the resource competition and exploitation. And a big one, economic impacts. So besides the ecosystems themselves, they can have really big impacts on the economy, economic losses through forest and agricultural productivity, diseases, and so forth. What to do about them? We have different things. We can monitor how invasive species are distributing, how it's spreading out. We can do risk assessments. How do they impact native species before they establish or before they have the really big impact? So we can do some more research on them, and we can eradicate them too. And that's usually in the early stages of establishment. So, quick question. Which do you think is the most cost-effective way to deal with the effect of invasive species? Is it prevention, prevent invasions before they occur, detection shortly after they have created infestations, study the problem for a few years, or try to eradicate the most widespread invaders? Okay?
Yeah. Substitute A and B.
A and B?
Because you might not have, I guess you'd have to know what's gonna come in. It's not surprise, but.
Well, but we know that it's in some other place.
Okay.
Okay, so we're actually knowing its native range, and we know that it's actually affecting some range and some habitats, and so now we're trying to see, is it gonna come to our range or not?
So A.
So A, is it unanimous? All right, we don't know yet. All right, so this is just a basic here scale of the invasion process. This is very important to know because the different stages require different strategies from us. You answered that, you said A is the most cost-effective way. That is correct. Okay, so prevention is better than control. Why is that?
Because you have to keep controlling it forever, basically.
Okay, and that means you need to spend more money, right?
And can you also like harm other species, like you might accidentally introduce something to try to control it and then harm other native species potentially?
So, can you say that again?
Like if you introduce something to control an invasive species, you might accidentally affect other organisms?
Yes, and that's some bad cases of biological control. So you need to study the new organism that you want to release against the invasive species. Quick question on non-native or exotic species are invasive, true or false? False. Alright? And when taken to a new habitat, non-native plants often threaten native plants of the new habitat. Why do they do this? Yes. So non-native plants, they compete with other organisms and with the native plants for their resources. It's very good. Okay? And last one, the field population, mouse population in Australia has grown so fast that they eat about an average of 4 billion wheat every year. What is that? Why? From where is that caused? That growth.
All of the above.
Well, I don't have that. Yes. So it's both the lack of the native species, okay, to eat the field mouse, so the absence of native predators and so forth, and the huge food supply. Okay. Again, the example, because what I've done in these 10 years is like my work has been part of a risk assessment, and what we did is we tested for the likelihood of encounter in the field with native species of ladybeetles. Okay? So what do we find out there? And then we checked for competition for food. So if the species, if the ladybeetle species are eating the same resources, or they're sharing the same food resources, that means they're likely to encounter themselves in the field. And then, if they do, then who's gonna win the battle? Okay, so 1-to-1, like larval predation, and to see if they do encounter themselves, who's gonna win. And just a quick, so this was done for multiple lady beetle species here, but then by multiplying the scores, we're giving a score, and the highest score means that they are likely to encounter themselves, they're sharing the same food resource, and then in the predation score, it's a high score. That means that species is really vulnerable to predation by the Asian multicolored ladybeetle. And then you get this score, which the highest means these 4 species here, and these are a couple of examples, those are most likely to be displaced in the field. Thank you so much for your attention.